Good afternoon. My name is Matt Weidinger, and I am the Rowe Fellow in Poverty Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Welcome to today's conversation with Secretary of Labor Eugene Scalia about the unemployment benefits response to the coronavirus crisis and its implications for the future. It's not quite enough to say that that response has been unprecedented. In just 2 months this spring, the number of unemployment benefit recipients rose from a typical 2 million to over 30 million, including millions in entirely new temporary federal programs covering large new categories of recipients. That's nearly 2.5 times peak claims during the Great Recession, which it literally took years to reach. While state agencies rushed to meet that enormous demand, we also know some recipients had to wait weeks or even months for benefits to be paid. Meanwhile, international criminal rings and individual scammers succeeded in fraudulently extracting literally billions of taxpayer dollars from these programs. And some employers expressed concerns the extraordinary federal benefits were discouraging returns to work. In all, over $500 billion in unemployment benefits have been paid this year, triple the previous high. And we know state and federal payroll taxes on jobs will rise in the years ahead to cover the cost of some of these extraordinary benefit payments. Congress is discussing whether, and if so, how to extend some of these temporary programs as we speak. Joining me today to discuss these and other important issues is Eugene Scalia, our country's 28th Secretary of Labor, who was sworn in on September 27, 2019. As Secretary, he oversees more than 180 federal employment laws covering more than 150 million workers and 10 million workplaces. In addition to serving on the White House Coronavirus Task Force, Secretary Scalia has guided the Labor Department as it played a central role in overseeing the new federal unemployment benefit programs intended to help workers and their families respond to COVID-19. Secretary Scalia's experience in government includes serving as Solicitor of Labor and as a special assistant to the Attorney General. Well before all that, he actually started his career in DC as a summer intern at AEI in the 1980s. So perhaps I should start by saying welcome back to AEI, Mr. Secretary. Before I turn over to Secretary Scalia, here's a brief overview of how our event will proceed. First, Secretary Scalia will offer his opening remarks. Then he and I will have a conversation about current benefit programs and their policy and other implications. And then finally, Secretary Scalia has agreed to field some questions from our audience. If you have a question for the Secretary, please send it to Jillian Wheeler on our staff here at Jillian, Jillian .Wheeler, Wheeler, @aei.org, or by using the hashtag DOL at AEI. Again, that's DOL, hashtag DOL at AEI on Twitter. We'll conclude all of that by 2:30 Eastern Time. And with that as an introduction, Mr. Secretary, welcome. The floor is yours.
Well, Matt, thank you. And it's a pleasure to be back at AEI for this event. My subject, as you said, is the nation's unemployment insurance system, which has valuable benefits to a record number of beneficiaries since March of this year. During that time, the system also faced great challenges. Those challenges exposed weaknesses that suggest improvement we can make to prepare for a future employment crisis. The basics of unemployment insurance are familiar. A worker who's lost his job applies to a state agency for benefits and receives a weekly payment that's calculated to replace a substantial portion, but not all, of prior wages, capped at a ceiling that's set by the state. Those amounts vary considerably by state. Mississippi has a maximum weekly benefit of $235, while Massachusetts' maximum is $1,234. So long as that worker's able and available for work and seeking work, he's eligible to receive UI for a certain number of weeks. For many states, that's 26 weeks, but it's as short as 12 weeks in some states. And in challenging economic times, the federal government will support states in extending benefits for a longer period. The unemployment insurance system is a federal-state partnership. State governments fund the benefit primarily through a tax on employers. States also determine eligibility and they distribute payments. The federal government, for its part, ensures that state programs conform to certain basic requirements of federal law and provide funding for states' administration of their programs. Incidentally, in the first half of March of this year, just before the national economy shut down, we at the Labor Department explained to states how they had flexibility within those substantive federal parameters to enable workers who had COVID or had family members with COVID to draw UI while not working. Essentially, we were saying that in the pandemic, UI could offer a form of partial paid leave. Well, within 2 weeks of that, the president signed the first ever federal paid leave law for the private sector. And 2 weeks after that, he signed the CARES Act with its unprecedented expansion of UI programs. That's how quickly things were moving in those weeks in March. Best known unemployment benefit under the CARES Act was a $600 supplemental payment, a federal plus up on top of the state benefit amount I mentioned earlier. Another new program was the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, or PUA, which provides benefits to those who couldn't work because of COVID and weren't otherwise eligible for unemployment benefits. This was principally for the self-employed, but others were eligible too. Paycheck Protection Program also warrants mention. By providing forgivable loans to small businesses if they kept workers on payroll, this was an important adjunct to UI and actually had 3 notable advantages. It kept workers connected to their employer, it was faster, and it avoided the drastic overpayments that resulted in some cases from the $600 plus up. If we're fortunate enough to experience a crisis like this one again, unfortunate enough to experience something like this again, a program like PPP should be a central part of the response. Our unemployment system provided valued benefits to millions of Americans this past year. Staff here at the Labor Department worked tirelessly to set up the CARES Act programs and to support the states running them. I'm proud of their efforts. Staff and officials in the states also made great efforts to implement the programs, but there were challenges. One challenge was how long it took states to process claims and get money to workers. Some delay was inevitable, given the volume of claims. Before this year, the most claims ever filed in a week was 695,000. This year, we had 2 weeks in a row where claims were nearly 7 million just in a week. And because of the booming economy we had enjoyed just days before, staffing levels at state UI offices were low. The delays were protracted and were painful to read. I directed staff to help states in a range of ways, yet still there were workers who waited several months for benefits. States were challenged too in implementing the new federal programs. The CARES Act was signed March 27th, but it was another month before every state was distributing that $600 plus up. The PUA benefit for the self-employed took longer. The last state began providing it 2.5 months after CARES was passed. Horribly outdated information technology systems played a major role in these problems. Nearly every state has its own unemployment IT system, and few have invested in upgrades. Some state systems are 40 years old. One governor I know who's very tech savvy told me that when the pandemic began overwhelming his state UI technology system, he hired software engineers from Latvia. That was the only place he could find still using the obsolete code that his UI system was running. When the CARES Act was being negotiated, I went to the Hill with the Treasury Secretary to warn that the state computers were incapable of implementing the new UI programs being considered. Secretary Mnuchin favored a separate Treasury-administered program, but the Democratic senators and a number of Republicans insisted on the UI system. One consequence of the antique state systems was that the federal plus-up amount could not be individually calibrated to a worker's prior wage, the way the underlying state benefit is. Programming for this would have taken 2 months or more. For political reasons, meanwhile, the plus-up amount could not be varied by state. You weren't going to find a lot of senators agreeing that someone who's unemployed in their state should get less from unemployment than if they were unemployed in some other state. So we ended up with a single flat national amount. That amount, $600 a week, when added to the regular state UI benefit, resulted in more than 75% of CARES Act claimants getting more on unemployment than they earned while working. That's what the most recent studies tell us. Massachusetts and Washington state workers could receive a maximum benefit that, on an annualized basis, totaled more than $70,000 a year. In Oklahoma, median wage replacement for unemployed workers was estimated to be 165%. In contrast to all of this, the federal plus-up in response to the Great Recession had been $25 a week, and it had ended with unemployment still at 9.3% nationally. My intent is not to criticize the CARES Act, which was an admirable bipartisan effort to support Americans who in many cases were being barred from earning a living by state or local government authorities. My point is that the rigidity of state computer systems cost taxpayers tens of billions of dollars by paying people more on unemployment than when they were working, something that no serious observer believes an unemployment system should do. A major challenge for the unemployment system was fraud. Abuse of the unemployment program is not new. Historically, about 10% of UI payments are what we call improper payments. The CARES Act programs have paid more than $380 billion to date. That implies potential improper payments of at least $38 billion. But the actual oversight on CARES must be far larger. On top of that $38 billion estimate should be added the billions that were misspent because state computers prevented us from tying the federal plus up to prior wage. And then we had the fact that the sheer generosity of the federal programs made them targets for criminal enterprises at a time that the states lacked the resources, the computers, and in some instances, I'm afraid, lacked the will to ensure that improper payments were not being made. Last summer, the Labor Department's Inspector General and the state of Maryland uncovered a $500 million fraud scheme in that state alone. In Washington state, officials reported paying out more than $500 million on more than 85,000 fraudulent claims. Fortunately, they say they recovered more than $300 million of that. The Wall Street Journal reports that California may have made $2 billion in fraudulent PUA payments. That's payments to, among others, infants, centenarians, prisoners, and terrorists. The CARES Act gave the Department's Inspector General $26 million to ensure integrity in the CARES UI programs. We've worked closely with the IG and with the states to emphasize the importance of combating fraud and to help them do so. I'm afraid, though, that U.S. taxpayers lost billions to unemployment insurance fraud during the pandemic. Well, our experience these last months points to some needed reforms in the UI system. First is fixing outdated technology so that benefits can be delivered to unemployed workers more quickly and tax dollars saved. This reform should be centered around a federally sponsored IT platform that can nimbly handle functions that are common to all state UI systems, recognizing that state benefit levels themselves will vary. Federal leadership is consistent with the federal government's role in funding the administration of UI programs. My department worked with Republican senators to incorporate this proposal in the HEALS Act legislation last summer. To be clear, nationalizing the UI system would be a mistake for reasons that I'll come to. And plus-ups to unemployment insurance should be rare. But if they're to occur again, we need the capacity to tailor payments to workers' prior wages. Under CARES, taxpayers lost billions by paying people more while unemployed than they earned while working. A modest investment to improve state UI computers will prevent that from recurring. Other benefits would come too with a technology upgrade, in addition to swifter delivery of benefits to those in need. Technology enhancements would give better protection against improper payments and fraud. States could more effectively track when workers returned to the job and were no longer eligible for payments. During the pandemic, many overwhelmed state agencies essentially gave up the blocking and tackling that's central to managing a UI program, including ensuring eligibility. Technology upgrades can bolster those capacities. In combating fraud and improper payments, it's essential that changes be made to the PUA program if it's extended. Basic changes would make a difference. Requiring eligibility documentation, including proof of prior income, ensuring that the income the claimant lost was her primary income, and mandating and funding more advanced identity verification. That said, I want to commend one aspect of the PUA program, that it was established to provide benefits to workers who were not employees of an employer paying into the unemployment insurance system. Independent contractors and self-employed deserve our respect. They should not all be crammed into the, quote, employee classification as California attempted with its ill-conceived AB5 legislation. But those of us who hold this view need to be thoughtful about programs and practices that can help gig workers and the self-employed gain access to important benefits that typically are associated with the employment relationship. Another area for improvement is how we distribute federal dollars to states to administer the unemployment program. Typically, states receive federal funding based on their past expenditures. The more they spent in year one, the stronger their claim for funding in year two. This does not incentivize efficiency. It also caught states understaffed when claims soared in March. My department is developing proposals for a more sensible, flexible system of administrative funding. Let me now mention something that the federal government should not do: launch a takeover of the current state-based nature of the unemployment insurance program. The sheer variety in states' views on UI benefits is one reason not to attempt to impose a uniform national program. As mentioned, Massachusetts, for example, has an average weekly benefit amount more than 5 times Mississippi's. Middle ground would be hard to find, and it would effectively result in some states sending money to other states to fund benefits larger than what they consider appropriate for their own residents. Perhaps more important, state governments are responsible for economic policies that can create or destroy jobs. States make their own economic beds to some extent. We must avoid an unemployment system in which residents of one state fund another state's improvident policies. In that regard, it's important to recognize how greatly state unemployment rates vary right now. Those state rates currently tell us more than the national rate does. The national rate in October, which is the last month for which we have state data, was 6.9% nationally. But half the states were at 6% or lower. On the other hand, California, our largest state economy, was at 9.3% unemployment, and New York was at 9.6%. We don't yet know all the reasons unemployment is so much higher in those states than most others. But those are regulatory states, and they have been more closed during the pandemic than many other states. We should not create a new nationalized unemployment system in which states that burden job creation call on other states to share the cost of the resulting unemployment. Let me conclude with this reminder. When we speak of unemployment insurance, we should always remember that our first choice for workers is work. Unemployment insurance is second best. It was partly for this reason that I was such a fan of the Paycheck Protection Program. We are fortunate that as a nation, we acted with bipartisan speed to make substantial employment benefits available last March. As we evaluate those programs and plan for the future, part of what we should consider too is how to best help Americans return to rewarding remunerative work. Matt, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. As a reminder for our audience, if you have a question for Secretary Scalia, please send it to Jillian Wheeler at Jillian, Jillian, .Wheeler, WHEELER, at AEI.org, or by using hashtag DOL at AEI on Twitter. So with that, Mr. Secretary, that was a tremendous summation of a really complicated set of permanent, temporary, state, federal, economic issues and programs that involve the UI program. I started by reviewing some of the downsides of the responses, but we also know the system has provided benefits to literally tens of millions of people, a record number of people at the time when more people than ever were in need. And meanwhile, the national unemployment rate, as well as many of the state rates that you discussed, have really recovered far more rapidly than many experts projected early on in the crisis. So let's start off with a happy note. What's the best part of the unemployment benefits response to the coronavirus crisis so far? What's worked best in your view?
Well, Matt, I think there are a lot of bright spots to what happened. First, as you said, it has been of immeasurable value to millions of Americans. And for that alone, we should be grateful. I'm impressed simply with how quickly and on what a strong bipartisan basis this legislation got done in March. This president is often criticized for allegedly being polarizing, but people forget really significant bipartisan achievements like the CARES Act, or I like to also mention the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, which was another important benefit for workers that had great bipartisan support. So the way the president and Congress came together in a grave crisis with a sweeping piece of legislation certainly was a success. I'd be remiss if I didn't commend the staff here at our Employment Training Administration, who really did work tirelessly, quickly, to do what they could to launch the program. They signed up states for participation the day after the president signed CARES, got all the signatures we needed for them to participate. They provided a great deal of guidance. When clarification was sought, they gave it. We did our best here. And I know the states worked very earnestly too. I'll mention again the Paycheck Protection Program, which again is not the subject of our discussion. I'll keep it brief. But when we look at things that helped workers, certainly that was a very important program too. And again, part of what I liked about it was, I think, probably a more efficient distribution system than the state UI systems, but also one that kept workers tied to their employer, so that as we reopened, they were in a better position to reopen their businesses and for workers to get back to work. And then, Matt, let me just conclude answering that question with where you started it, which is the results are good too. And we still have many more people out of work right now than we want. We're also in a challenging period with the virus where mitigation measures are more important than they've been in some time. And I will underscore that. But we have unemployment at such a lower rate right now nationally than anybody was predicting. I, back in April, said I thought we could get under 10% this year. That was perceived by a lot of people as very, very optimistic. But we are nationally at 6.7% for the month of November. More than half the states at 6% or lower. And so we've come a really long way. And I think the CARES Act and these UI programs get some of the credit for that.
Great. So that response, the response from the CARES Act and other legislation this spring, we know has been temporary in nature. And some of those benefits, like the $600 plus up you described, have already expired. And other key benefits, like the PUA program and several regimes of state extended or federal extended benefits, are authorized through this month. So I know you can't get into details about the current extension talks going on the Hill, but what lessons should policymakers making decisions about what to do next take from the experience that we've seen in the operation of these benefit programs to this point?
Well, I think there are a number of things for people to keep in mind as they look down the road. Obviously, I've talked about technology improvements that over the long term, I believe that we have to have. Now, those would take more than just a couple of months to implement. But as I mentioned, if we ever find ourselves in the situation where Congress and the president agree that we need some federal employment supplement, we're going to be in such a better position if we can calibrate it to prior wage. So that's I think, a longer term lesson. The $600 plus up was too much. That might have been a little bit hard to discern in March. Part of what happened is unemployment hit a more targeted set of workers than was expected. It hit lower wage workers, and so those are people that particularly need the government's help at times. But we don't want to have a situation where they're getting more in unemployment benefits than they did while working, because there's some problematic incentives that come with that, which are recognized across the political spectrum. So 600 was too high. I remind people that in the Great Recession, it was just $25 a week. There's been talk about $300. That's another number that's out there. That results in about 75 or so percent of people on unemployment getting 70% wage replacement or more. 70% wage replacement is the rate that employee advocates look for. And so the $300 amount, I think hits or probably overshoots by a little bit the mark that even those advocates set. But that's another number that you hear in terms of the plus up. Fraud is plainly a very, very serious problem that's being addressed by many states, our department, the FBI, and that needs to be addressed too by Congress, and any extension, for example, of the PUA program in the ways that I mentioned. We need to have better certification of who's applying for the benefits. We need better ways of determining that they actually did have prior income that was primary to them and that needs to be replaced. That's going to be, I think, very important if we're going to have a PUA extension. And last, Matt, I'll mention again how important I think it is that policymakers keep in mind how much the unemployment experience varies right now among states. And there are some states, I didn't mention Nevada, Hawaii, high unemployment rates, and I think we understand why. But with half the states, it's 6% or lower. It's not the dire situation at all that we confronted in March. And in fact, Senator Ron Wyden and Minority Leader Schumer proposed legislation last summer, which essentially said when unemployment is at 6% or lower than 6%, there shouldn't be a federal plus up. And I think that's worth keeping in mind during the current discussions.
Yep. So just to be clear, on your point on the administrative side of the system and the question of whether it should be facile enough to provide somebody with their amount equivalent to their prior wage. We have the first vaccines going in arms today. So hopefully we're on the downward slope of this current crisis, but we don't know what's to come in the future. But your view on that is it's worth it for investments to be made in this system so that in the event of some future crisis, say another pandemic 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, the system is capable of satisfying what policymakers wanted to have happen this spring, but couldn't. That is that individuals would be paid something equivalent to what they were previously making, but not more, because we had to go with some national fixed amount for political and other reasons.
That's right. I don't often find myself a proponent of increased federal spending. As I look at what happened in CARES programs this summer, and I look down the road to the possibility, who knows, 10, 20 years from now, some time from now, we'll have another severe unemployment crisis. When I look to that point, I want states to get money out more quickly. I want states to be able to target payments, that federal payment, to prior wage. Let me give you another example, Matt, that you'll be familiar with. Some other listeners will. And I don't want to get too far in the weeds with short-time compensation, but short-time compensation is an alternative form of unemployment where instead of laying workers off in full, an employer reduces wage hours across the board for workers, maybe drops hours down to 30, not 40. And an unemployment benefit is made available to sort of bridge the gap in part. When you have an inflexible $600 a week plus up to anybody who gets even the smallest amount of unemployment benefits, there's some problems with those short-time compensation programs. We had the city of Portland, Oregon put a program in place so that it could draw federal money and have workers work less and actually get paid more than Portland was paying them. That was abusive, but an inflexible plus-up made it possible. And so my view is that if we're going to have a plus-up, I'd like to have Congress and the president come together at that point in time and say, we have a serious national problem to the point where we need a plus-up. If we reach that point again, I want to be able to do it in a targeted way that's going to be, I think, actually better for workers as well as better for the economic rebound.
Before we leave the $600 bonus question, I know you've had a lot of conversations with employers about the actual effect of that. And there's been studies that suggested that it didn't have an effect on discouraging individuals from returning to work. And, anecdotal evidence from employers said, well, no, actually, we have had some difficulty getting our workers back. You want to comment on some of those discussions with employers and sort of where we are now and, where you think that issue is?
There's been a lot of really just, fascinating research on these unemployment programs and unemployment more generally that's been conducted since March. And I want to thank the scholars who've done that work. Matt, thank you. And there have been a number of studies which purport to show that paying people more for being on unemployment than they got paid for working does not slow people down in returning to work, does not disincentivize return to work. I think there have been some studies that suggest otherwise. With all respect to the scholars on that particular point, I just don't agree for a couple of reasons. One is I think sheer common sense. At the margins, there are some number of people who are going to say, well, wait, you're telling me I can get more not working than working? Maybe I'll not work for a little while. At the margins, there will be some people that say that, and unemployment systems are based on that belief. Secondly, though, as I traveled once the economy was reopening, I did not speak to a group of employers, to a chamber of commerce, or the like, where I did not hear about workers who they were trying to get back, but who weren't coming back until the plus-up ended. These employers described conversations they'd had. These employers said to me, they said, and Gene, I didn't want to force these workers back because I knew this was helpful to them and their families, and I didn't want to call the state on them and say that they should be taken off unemployment. So based on what I heard from so many employers who, by the way, they didn't have an incentive to complain about the size of the plus-up, unless indeed it was making it harder for them to bring their workers back. And so for those reasons, I do think that at least at the margins, the plus-up was slowing the return to work of some workers. I also think when you look at the data about how claims dropped after the plus-up really dried up, I think that provides some support for my position as well.
So we both talked about the unprecedented surge in claims for benefits this spring, including and part of that was complicated by the federal government's creating the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program. All these programs, so this basic state UI program, these federal temporary programs, are all really operated by the states, which have been under tremendous pressure to get benefits out the door. Just thinking about all that complexity, how would you grade the state response, and what sort of going forward can the federal government do to help states improve that response in the future?
I would say the state response was, very energetic, very well-intended, overwhelmed at times. There obviously, and this was a major point of my remarks, there were serious problems getting benefits to people, Americans across the country, and some of those remain. I was reading Friday about one state that's still paying benefits out for people unemployed in July, and that's just a really, really serious problem. But So these are grave problems that we need to look for ways to fix. I think the states did work hard. As I said, they had primitive systems they were working with. And I think, unfortunately, there were instances where states were tempted to prioritize just getting the money out the door over ensuring as well that it was going to people who were entitled to and actually needed the money. I think the door was open a little bit wider to fraud than it might have been in other circumstances. And it was a bit of a cycle where because there were delays, there was more pressure to get the money out, which resulted in less effort to guard against fraud. There were at least one or two states that wanted to just pay all comers and then do an audit later and find out whether they were entitled to it and try to claw the money back. And that wasn't an acceptable way to run a state program. But I want to, again, be clear that the states and the Labor Department were hit by claims for unemployment insurance of a magnitude we've never, ever seen before in American history. It came at a time when staffing was very low because the economy had been so strong. I mean, if I were governor 2 years ago, I would not have been investing in my unemployment insurance program, unfortunately, probably. So maybe I've learned some lessons in this experience about looking very, very far down the road for something that eventually will come. And then because of the generosity of the program, we also, I think, had unprecedented amounts of fraud. So we all learned a lot. Certainly, we here at the U.S. Department of Labor did, and I know the states did too, and how they run their programs and in the technology that they do need to change.
You mentioned in your comments some question about states' will to kind of prevent improper payments from going out the door. Clearly that's going to be more likely to be the case when states are spending somebody else's money, which is really what the federal response was. So the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, 100% federally funded, that in effect competed against the state UI program, where states knew if they put somebody on UI, an employer would have to pay higher payroll taxes down the line. They would have to answer that. The federal money, in contrast, was kind of free to them. Can you talk a little bit about those issues involving the sort of state versus federal nature of these benefit programs and any sort of lessons that you see from that going forward?
Well, sure. I mentioned earlier what Portland, Oregon did for at least some of its workers, where it reduced their hours in order to establish one of these short-time compensation programs and then paid its folks more to work less. Which was something it felt comfortable doing, in part, I'm sure, because it wasn't their money. And so there is a risk there, what some would call, I suppose, a moral hazard. And in any future PUA program, for instance, which was a 100% federally funded program, I do think that's one of the reasons that we need to put measures into the program to make fraud harder, because states' incentive to go after improper payments when it's not their money, or they're just going to be less. And I'm not accusing any specific state of being indifferent to it. I wouldn't go that far. But I have no doubt that there were some jurisdictions that were less troubled about potential improper payments when it was federal dollars versus state dollars. And that's a reason that the federal government, Congress, does need to be attentive to that fraud risk in any programs going down the road. Again, Matt, I gave you the example of some states that wanted to just make the payments in the first instance and then go recover the money later, when more than half of the money going out is federal, not state money. I expect that that's a less troubling course than if they were all state dollars. I should add finally that states do have obligations to recover money under federal law that exist regardless of what the exact fraud protections built into the law are. And my department has followed up with states in cases where we thought they needed to be more vigorous in pursuing fraud, to talk to them about that.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the reform proposals kind of going forward based on the lessons that we've seen in the past several months. You made reference to Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer and Finance Committee ranking member Ron Wyden, who proposed making the bonuses, the plus ups of up to $600 per week, and also lengthy extensions of federal extended unemployment benefits payable in high unemployment states. They want to make that a permanent feature in effect of federal law. That's very different from how this concluding Congress now and past Congresses have responded to recessions and other crises like this, which is to provide benefits on a temporary basis. Talk a little bit about some of the concerns you have about those sort of permanent stimulus proposals.
Yeah, I think that, as has been said at various points during this crisis, that COVID legislation really needs to be focused on fixing, addressing the challenges that COVID has presented. And we need to be extremely careful and guard against attempts to use this current crisis as a reason to create vast new, essentially permanent programs. And when we talk about permanently establishing a $600 a week plus up from the federal government for people who are unemployment, I think we are talking about creating such an enormous federal entitlement program during this time of crisis. And I think it would be a serious mistake. I'll say again that I'm not here to criticize the CARES Act. I think CARES Act was an admirable accomplishment in a time of great need where, among other things, Americans around the country were being barred from working based on what state and local authorities determined was a necessary public health measure. So I'm not here to criticize what was done then, but I testified before the Senate Finance Committee about the $600 plus up, and I said if there is another program after July, it shouldn't be $600. And I was criticized by Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio, who his point was, well, if we paid people a proper amount for working, he said if we paid them $15 a week minimum wage, would you have a basis to be concerned about people remaining on unemployment, even with a plus up, rather than going to work? So his point was, well, the plus up would be a problem if we paid people $15 an hour at least. And I said, well, unfortunately it would, because $600 a week is equivalent to a $15 an hour minimum wage, except again, it's going to people who are unemployed, not to people who are working that minimum wage job. And then on top of that, you had the state benefits. So I think this proposal to keep in any form on any long-term basis the $600 plus up is a mistake. And my own view is that any built-in federal plus up at this time is a mistake. I think we should have computer systems in place that, should a consensus ever form again for a plus up, we can give the American people the plus up that Congress believes is appropriate, rather than having our options hardly constrained by technological limitations. But I think we want the Congress, the president, to come together at a particular point in time and say, looking at the economy right now, we need something additional from the federal government for unemployment compensation. I've already described why I think there are risks in a program that potentially permanently enables one group of states to draw funding from another for unemployment problems that potentially their own policies contributed to. I think that's one concern I have. But consider as well that during the Great Recession, Congress, President came together and said the plus up that we need is $25 a week. And then just a little more than 10 years later, they come together and say we need a $600 a week plus up. With policy prescriptions that different in economic environments that were that different, I don't think it's possible to frame up a sort of permanent federal unemployment plus up approach to meet all circumstances. Let's have a computer system. Let's have technology that can work, but let's have a situation where Congress and the president come together and determine on a case-by-case basis.
Got it. And that, of course, is a fraction of the issues that would be created if we developed a sort of nationalized UI program where you had benefit amounts, durations, eligibility terms all set in Washington, as opposed to the individual states, which are very different, obviously, in their economic bases and the amount that people pay in taxes, the wage levels, and all that. So before we want to wrap up, we have a couple of questions from the audience. Let me pose the first one to you, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Secretary, you mentioned the advantages of the Paycheck Protection Program. This allowed employers to stay connected with employees, and it was a quicker mechanism to get financial support to employees. One concern was that the PPP was only available to small businesses. Was there or is there another policy solution for large corporations to support employees, or is there some expectations that large corporations should bear that burden?
It's a fair question. Again, I think that the Paycheck Protection Program was a very successful program for a lot of workers at small businesses. There were also some programs that helped support workers at larger companies. I believe there are certain industries, airlines may have been among them, that received some support that did enable them to keep workers on payroll longer. I think, and obviously there were also a variety of loan facilities, programs that enabled larger companies to get credit at on very favorable terms. So they were better positioned to keep running, to keep workers on payroll and the like. And by the way, when I met with larger employers who have more resources to draw on, I'm thinking, for example, the meeting the president convened of some of the large employers in Las Vegas. Some of those companies kept their workers on payroll for, I believe, a month or two, or maybe even slightly more, even though people weren't working. So I think the larger companies do have more resources from which to do that. They may have reputational reasons to want to be able to do it as well. And I think it makes sense for the federal government to look at loan programs that they can help, that can help those large companies. But as companies get larger, obviously taxpayers get much more hesitant to, for example, give forgivable loans than when they're talking about a very small business, a restaurant that's had to shut down by state order, for example.
Okay, we're in the lightning round now. So can you talk more about independent contractors and how we might innovate UI programs to adapt to new models of work? We know women value flexibility and choose independent contracting. And I would add to that, the PUA program that covers independent contractors now is supported by federal general revenues. If we made that sort of program a permanent part of the system going forward, obviously somebody's going to have to pay for those benefits and somebody's taxes are going to go up. Do you have any thoughts about the sort of tax side of that if it were made kind of a permanent part of the program?
Well, I think it's a discussion, having in this area and in other areas too. I should mention a couple of rulemakings that we've had here at the Labor Department. One is an ongoing rulemaking defining who is an independent contractor for purposes of the Fair Labor Standards Act. We proposed that earlier this year. We're looking to finalize it sometime soon. And that rule is intended to recognize and respect that, as an example you gave, that a number of people like the flexibility that comes with being independent contractors. And when they genuinely are independent contractors rather than workers, we ought to respect that status rather than force them to be employees. We adopted a rule last year for what we called association health plans, which made it much easier for small businesses to band together and get a better price and more tailoring on healthcare. And actually the self-employed were also eligible to participate. That program was stayed by a court here in Washington. We're still waiting for the Court of Appeals to rule. The case was argued more than a year ago, which is unusual. So that was something else that was we did to help independent contractors get the kind of benefits that we want workers to be able to have, even when they don't have an employer. With respect to unemployment insurance, particularly, I think what we would be talking about might, for example, be a model where independent contractors voluntarily are given the option to pay into a system, or where the companies that they work with, I'm thinking of platform companies, for example. I won't name names, but that provide transportation services, delivery, and the like. You could also see a system where they agree to pay in and provide what amounts to a form of unemployment support to the contractors that are working for them. We saw some of the large platform companies extend benefits of one form or another to their workers during the COVID crisis. So I think those are the kinds of approaches that are that merit discussion, Matt. And I think if we don't open ourselves to that discussion, we certainly open ourselves to the argument that all these folks should be treated as employees, even when under, I think, most reasonable understandings, they're not actually employees.
Right. So additional question. You mentioned short-time compensation programs. Do you think those programs are effective, and why haven't more states made use of them, including during the CARES Act era when the federal government is picking up 100% of the cost if states adopt short-time compensation programs in law?
Matt, I think that short-time compensations are a very worthy idea. And again, it's fairly straightforward. The concept is that rather than laying off individual workers, an employer can reduce the hours of workers across the board, and then all of them are eligible for a smaller amount of unemployment insurance. That has the benefits of, for example, continuing healthcare contributions that all those employees would have, of keeping all of them tied to an employer, of having them better positioned to come back to work when, or to come back to full hours when the employer is ready to do it. And importantly, although these kinds of programs are thought of as so-called layoff aversion programs, it's easy to see how a company that was closed but can now partially reopen could use these programs as well. So I think that it's a good concept. I can't claim that it's been implemented broadly enough in this country to assess how effective it is. One of the problems over the last few months was, again, that by any objective measure, the state unemployment offices were just overwhelmed. It was a great problem for them, great challenge. And I think no more than half the states had short-time compensation programs in place when CARES was enacted. And although they might have been interested in doing the program, they were putting enormous resources into getting payments out, into doing some of the other things that you need to do to administer an unemployment program. And then finally, Matt, I did mention the concern that I had here that we had some jurisdictions that appeared to be using short-time compensation as a way to get more money, federal money, to people who were working really, and had only marginally reduced hours, and that was a concern that I had in touting short-time compensation to the same extent that I might have done in other circumstances once I saw some that appeared to me to be a misuse of the program.
Agreed. Let's go back to kind of one of your closing themes in your statement. You said ultimately the UI program is about helping reconnect the unemployed with work. What are some things that the department does to try to do that? And what are some things that are going to be especially valuable as we go forward in this event to help achieve that outcome, which is what we really want?
Well, Matt, I think the most important lesson about work over the last 4 years or so is the extraordinary job market that we had before COVID came, where we had unemployment at a 50-year low. Before President Trump was elected in the summer 2016, estimates were that we would create just under 2 million jobs in the 3 years from January 2017 to January 2020. The nation created 7 million jobs during that period. And what you see is that the president put in place tax cuts and programs to reduce regulation where regulation is unnecessary that he believed would lead to job creation. And that's what happened. And not only did we have job creation, we had wages suddenly increasing much more than they had during the prior administration. And increasing even more for lower wage workers. So when I look at what is helpful to workers, we've spent so much time these last 9 months talking about federal programs, and we needed to. But we've got to remember that jobs are created by the private sector. And every measure we take, including a plus up, has to be taken in part with an eye toward what will be the impact of this on job creation, job attainment in the private sector, because that's where the jobs are created. And our first choice for workers is work. And so I begin with what set of policies did President Trump have in place over those 3 years and many still now that led to that great job creation, that led to rising wages, that led to wages going up more for low wage workers than for higher income workers, which was a reversal from the growing wage gap during the last administration. I think those are really important things to bear in mind. And then finally, I'll mention this. The states, certainly they have unemployment insurance programs to help people who are unemployed, but they also have programs which the federal government funds to help people find work, to take them off unemployment, put them back to work. And as we look where more federal dollars might go, those programs are worth consideration too. And ideally, I mentioned this briefly in my remarks, we have a system with far faster, better, more nimble computers where there's communication in a real-time basis between folks in the unemployment program and folks in the business of helping workers get back to work, so that as jobs become available for which somebody who's on unemployment is qualified and suited, the people assisting with reemployment are able to have a conversation with people helping with unemployment and help the worker make the transition from unemployment to work. And we've spent a lot of time here at the department over the last 4 years working for ways that we can improve those job training and development programs. Apprenticeships have been, I think, an extremely encouraging development in the last few years in helping people train for new kinds of work. And so I think the work that's been done in that area is encouraging, and better coordination with the UI system would be useful too.
I'm getting the 2-minute warning here, so let me just wrap up with this. So you've been doing this job for a little more than a year. What do you believe are the best things that you've accomplished, and what do you think? What do you think about that in terms of your accomplishments as secretary?
I think what I feel most fortunate about is having had a chance to be in this job during a time when we did see just extraordinary job growth, wages rising for lower income workers. I think some of the deregulatory changes we made here at the Labor Department contributed to that growth that we saw. And so I felt fortunate to be able to assist over the last year with those policies and to watch this great economy develop. Obviously, our support of workers during the pandemic has been a key part of what we've done over this last year on the unemployment side, but also with occupational safety and health, and with that first federal paid leave benefit under the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which we put a rule out to help administer in just a couple of weeks. So that coronavirus response is something that's been very important to us. We've done our all. And then finally, we've aimed to support workers, the economy more generally, through more targeted, effective law enforcement here at the department, something I've spent a fair amount of time on, and also looking for ways to reduce needed regulatory burdens or clarify the law. Those are major priorities too, Matt.
Secretary, we're coming up on 2:30, so promised we'd be done by then. So that'll be the last word. Secretary Scalia, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Matt. It's been my pleasure.
Likewise.